One of the Strugatsky's brothers, Arkady, the famous science fiction authors in Russia, he did not fully believe in alien life. He understood that it's probably not rational or even academic to assume that we are the only ones in the universe, so he allowed for the possibility, but more importantly, he was vehemently against any contact with aliens. He foresaw two possible outcomes: a total regression and boom in religious thinking as escapism, or alternatively, aliens sharing with us their more advanced technology and inventions, and thus a full total stop of any scientific development here on Earth. Neither really appealed to him. So his view was, if aliens ever come to Earth, tell them to leave, pack up and fly away on their saucer 1,000 parsecs away, and tell them to come back 200 years later, but not to Earth, but to the North Pole of Pluto, and we'll meet them there. If we are not there, then come back 200 years later, and so on and so forth, and then we will see. Why do I bring this up? Well... Have you read Roadside Picnic? It should be a little bit more obvious by the end of the video. For the longest time, science fiction in Soviet Union and Russia was dormant. In local literary studies, it is often bundled with fantasy in the speculative fiction genre, so you will often see people like Alexander Green or even Mikhail Bulgakov attached to the genre. Fantasy and departure from realism in general is obvious in the prose of the turn-of-the-century fiction. You can see it in authors like Kuprin, Andreev, Brusov, Platonov, or Alexander Green and Mikhail Bulgakov. Bulgakov probably comes closest to what we would now define as science fiction. Like, for example, The Heart of the Dog. It is fantastical, yes, but it's still rooted in some sort of science. Early 20th century also introduced the genre of utopia and dystopia that also exists somewhat on the outskirts of science fiction, and one of the first dystopias in the world was We by Evgeny Zamyatin. But as far as true science fiction, early 20th century in Russia or Soviet Union had very little to offer. The authors of the time focused on the near future in fiction, and in Soviet Union it materialized more as glorification of the Soviet achievements in science and technology and was severely lacking in deeper ideas and meanings. The books of that time were basically ads describing the inventions that would help people in the nearest future, like a new tractor, for example, and thus were incredibly boring. Most of the authors and books of that time have not made a place in history for themselves, except for maybe Alexander Belyaev with his series of short stories, most notably The Amphibian Man. But that style of boring science fiction continued through all of 1930s through 1950s, when a new wave in science fiction started. The authors like Ivan Yefremov with his Andromeda, A Space Age Tale, or even Polish author Stanislav Lem with his The Astronauts of Solaris, they were pushing the boundaries of the genre, moving further away in space and time. But most importantly, that's when the Strugatsky brothers come on stage to change the genre forever. Because Strugatsky is the science fiction in the Soviet Union. The brothers, despite their shared literary journey, had lived quite different lives. Their paths diverged quite early on. Older brother Arkady was born 28th of August 1925, the younger Boris 8 years later, 15th of April 1933. Their father was an art historian, their mother was a high school teacher, so the culture of reading was present in the family. The childhood for the both of them fell on Stalin's time in Russia. Their father was almost subject to political repression but lucked out, but their uncle was executed. And then World War II started. The family was in Leningrad, current-day St. Petersburg, when the city fell under the blockade, one of the most traumatic experiences for Russia during World War II. The father was offered a spot to go down the road of life, the only way out of the city at the time, down the frozen lake of Vladarskaya. Unfortunately, Boris was sick and the parents were afraid that he might not make the journey. So they made a rather hard choice and they separated. The father took Arkady along with him down the road of life, and the mother stayed with Boris in the blockaded city. They figured that way at least one of the boys had a chance of surviving. I cannot even imagine making that type of choice. It's not even between the rock and a hard place. The city was starving. People were dying every single day, but the road of life, it also took lives. It was a dangerous path, constantly under German bombardment. The truck that Arkady and his father took, it fell through the ice. They had to push it out with their bare hands. Then they had to walk in freezing winter, then days on a cold freight train. Arkady ended up waking in a hospital days later with severe injuries, and he was told that his father didn't make it. Boris and their mother stayed in the blockaded city for another 2 years. Their only saving grace was that they had the ration stamps from Arkady and their father that sustained them for a little longer, until when in 1943 Arkady could finally get them out of the city. Neither brother really liked talking about this period in their lives, but even the snippets of it are simply heartbreaking, like Arkady pleading for his father to go on when neither had any energy left, like a 10-year-old Boris waiting the whole day by the door, waiting for their mother, not ever being sure that she'd come back, the corpses in the street, the hunger. I'm mentioning this because if I say that the brothers have survived a blockade, a Russian person instantly knows how traumatic it must have been. And it's not the point of the video, but I want you to understand that this event was foundational to all of us as a nation, but for them it was also personal. But this is also the point where the brothers' paths have separated. They stayed in contact as much as they possibly could, but they almost never lived in the same city from this point on. Arkady turned 18 in 1943 and was supposed to join the army, but in another lucky strike of fate, he got accepted into a military institute for foreign languages, where he became a military interpreter from English and Japanese. He worked in the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, and he spent most of the 1950s in the Far East of Russia, Kamchatka and Khabarovsk. After his retirement from service, he moved to Moscow and worked for the All-Russian Institute for the Scientific and Technological Information. He was also an editor for the main publishing houses in Russia. But starting from there, he dedicated most of his life to literature. Boris, on the other hand, he returned to Leningrad in 1945. He studied at Leningrad University, Faculty of Mathematics and Mechanics, majoring in astronomy. He then worked at Pulkovo Observatory as an engineer, but just like his brother, by the 1960s, most of his efforts were dedicated to literature. Boris outlived his brother by 11 years. Arkady passed away in 1991 and Boris 2012. But as you can see, the brothers have brought quite different experiences into their writing. Boris, the hard science and academia, and Arkady, more humanities and military. Both brothers spoke English. Arkady also spoke Japanese, so they read quite a bit of foreign fiction. Arkady, in his professional capacity, had access to more books than your average Joe. Their style of collaboration took a little while to establish itself. They tried different approaches on how to write together. It was imperative to them that the books were the product of the both of them. And that was obviously complicated by them living in different cities. In the end, what worked for them was meticulous planning. Every plot point, every detail, all of this was discussed for months until they would meet somewhere, normally in a town Komarova, to write it all down. Boris described it as beefing up a skeleton. They would only meet when the skeleton was ready so they could meet it up together. Their approach to science fiction was described by one of the brothers in 3 words. Miracle, secret, and authenticity. Miracle comes from the scientific inventions or in any other assumptions that they make about their fictional worlds. Science in their fiction can sometimes feel like magic, i.e. they don't always give scientific explanations for how the things work, and that's not really necessarily needed. Secret comes from other genres that they borrow from, like adventure, detective, or spy stories. All of them require some suspense and resolution, and that's often how Strugatsky stories are structured. Authenticity is interesting. It can be summed up as such. One fantastical allowance needs to create multitudes of plausible consequences. That meaning, if your hook is that aliens have visited Earth, then the consequences of that visit need to be rooted in reality, something that the reader would believe to be true. What Strugatsky also do with authenticity, plausibility, truthfulness, whatever, that it comes from the characters as well. The characters need to be believable. If you take a software IT developer and put him into what basically amounts to being Hogwarts for adults, how would he behave? Or if you take a German officer of 1940s and put him into a city under a dome, would he grab the power or would he let it be? Another thing about Strugatsky's writing that it's incredibly easy to read. It's light, it's ironic, it's funny. Even when they deal with the heavier subjects, they don't make the text itself too burdensome. It's the language that you would expect to hear from the young academics of the 1960s Soviet Union. But for me personally, that's what makes it powerful. Suspense can be created for a single word, and the resolution delivered for things left unsaid, and to me that's masterful. I'm going to talk Roadside Picnic later in the video, but first I wanted to talk Strugatsky Bibliography first and how it transformed and evolved over time because I find it fascinating. And their literary journey begins with the Ashes of Bikini. 1954, USA were performing thermonuclear tests at Bikini Atoll, Marshall Islands, and those tests led to radioactive contamination of the area, and that included a Japanese fishing vessel, Lucky Dragon No. 5, and its 23 crew members who all got radiation poisoning. Arkady, who was stationed in the Far East at the time, he followed the story closely, and at the suggestion of his friend Leo Petrov, he wrote a short story that described the events that led to the test, and the fallout from the radiation poisoning for the Japanese fishermen. The story was first published in 1956 in a magazine called Дальний Восток. Both Arkady and Lev Petrov are credited as authors, although it is now somewhat agreed that Petrov only provided the idea and Arkady did all of the writing. This is one of few books that the brothers haven't written together. If either of the brothers ever wrote something without the participation of the other, they did it under a pseudonym. Arkady chose S. Vititsky and Boris S. Yaroslavtsev. But obviously most of their bibliography and the most famous pieces were done together in collaboration. It is rather hard to say now when that collaboration actually started, and it's fairly recent history, but still it is already full of mystification and some of it coming straight from the source. Boris wrote a book called Commentary to the Past, where he provided additional details as to their writing style and publication history, but some of it already read as revisionist history, or at the very least his view from the 1990s to the events that happened in the 1960s, thus more of an interpretation rather than true hard facts. A fairly popular legend has it that the brothers were once together in Leningrad walking down the Nevsky Avenue and they were discussing, i.e. bashing the state of science fiction at the time, that boring kind that I mentioned in the beginning of the video, and one of their wives got so tired of them criticizing it that she said, well, are you so smart? Then write something rather than criticizing others. And so they did. And thus the Land of the Crimson Clouds was born as a result of a bet. It is a legend, hard to say how true it is, especially since there are records of brothers writing short stories together as early as 1946, but at least The Land of the Crimson Clouds is the first novel that they published together. Researchers define various stages in Strugatsky's writing, their style, their themes, their mood, it all changed over time. In this video, I do not want to get bogged down with specific stages and years, it's all out there, some of it is done by English researchers, you can look it up if you're interested. What I want to do is speak to you about the broad trends in their fiction and how it changed over time, what brought the change on, and how it is reflected in their novels. As you can see, the brothers start their literary journey in the 1960s, the period in Soviet history that is called Khrushchev thaw. The thaw is defined by a certain amount of liberalization after the hard rule of Stalin, in a process that's literally called destalinisation. The repressions and censorship were lifted enough that people could finally take a breath. But that period is also characterized by a strong belief in the communist message, and especially the communist future that was promised to Soviets. The intelligentsia of the time believed that with Stalin finally gone, they could finally build that communist future, that bright, shining communist future that was promised to them. And Strugatsky were no exception. If you look at their early novels, the future that they describe is a communist utopia. Like the novel Noon 22nd Century, where they give a detailed description of this future with all of its inventions, customs, work ethics, and such. It's all a world of communist victory. Other novels set in the same universe are Space Apprentice and Far Rainbow. But the nature of that utopia is also interesting. One of the brothers said that the communist future that was promised to them was full of negatives. It was a world with no class system, no government, no exploitation, no inequality, no poverty, no wars. But what was there? It was a shiny, bright world, but it was completely and utterly empty. And so the brothers decided to fill this world with their own values and ideas that were also the values and ideas of their readers. Because Strugatsky also had a very distinctive readers group. The Communist Party called them ETWs, engineering and technical workers, scientists, academics, PhDs, technicians of hard sciences. The number of people in hard sciences grew substantially in the 1950s and 60s, and they formed the approximation of the middle class in USSR. They were the intelligentsia of the time that later, ironically, became the dissidents. People like Sakharov and Solzhenitsyn, they all come from this class. Liberal arts got pushed to the side, and in general, hard sciences received a little bit more freedom from state control and surveillance, as the greatness of USSR was envisioned in the amount of iron produced per capita, or who wins the arms race, and those were the things that hard sciences could help with. And on the other side of the spectrum, liberal arts has always been viewed like frivolous or even dangerous. And moreover, by our ETWs, it was viewed as collaborative with the Communist Party because the only genre of literature, for example, allowed in USSR was socialist realism, thus very much of the communist propaganda. So this academic intelligentsia was Strugatsky's readers group, and so they described the communist utopia as a place where this type of people would like to live and work. Think about it, where they'd like to live and work. These young researchers, the strata of Strugatsky's readers. Most obvious example is a novel called Monday Begins on Saturday. It even has a subtitle, A Fairy Tale for Young Researchers, where the events take place in a research institute of sorcery and wizardry. Or in Andrew Bromfield's 2002 translation, it's called the National Institute for the Technology of Witchcraft and Thermatry, abbreviated to NITWIT, because in Russian it also has a funny abbreviation. And in this story, these researchers and academics are just basically wizards, and they go on different adventures. The Strugatsky utopia is a place where a person can let their creativity loose, make scientific discoveries, and have adventures. It's a world where people sneak into work on Saturday because they simply cannot wait until Monday. And this type of utopia calls a certain type of protagonist that's going to appear in most of Strugatsky's worlds. It is the creator or the progressor, the term that comes from the universe of Noon, 22nd Century. It is a person who comes from this bright future and travels to worlds less involved than that, and adventure ensues. An exceptional man surrounded by others. Others who view progress as a way to get rich or simply as a way of getting a new washing machine. Others who do not care about these noble goals, scientific breakthroughs, unless they have something to gain from it. Strugatsky understood that the world that they wanted to live in was not the same world that the rest of the world wanted. The Communist Party wanted enrichment, the masses simply wanted to eat, and neither was really interested in enlightenment or scientific adventures. And thus, their protagonist, their progressor, who's striving to new heights, is a minority who is opposed to the ruling class and to the masses, because the ruling class wants to reap the benefits and the masses simply want to conform. And the crystallization of that conflict coincides with the brothers' disillusionment with communism in USSR. It happened quite early on, by mid-1960s, when Khrushchev returned to repressions amongst the writers. And that change can already be seen in the novel Hard to Be a God. Hard to Be a God was first envisioned as a simple adventure story, like the novels before it, but was soon rewritten into something much more complex than that. Hard to Be a God is a novel that borrows a lot from spy fiction. The progressor Rumata, who comes from a way more advanced world, he's a scientist and he is assigned with watching a planet called Arkanar that is at a stage close to what we would describe as Middle Ages. He is following the rule of no interference. He is there to observe. The only thing that he and his colleagues allow themselves is to save the various intellectual scientists from the clutches of the government that is prosecuting them. There are two conflicts right here. The protagonist is opposing the government in a character of Don Reba, Etiquette Beria, by the way, but he's also opposing the people, the masses, as he sees them as allowing the government the persecution of intellectuals. Romata feels the connection to the intellectuals. They are his peers. He describes them as enzymes, as vitamins that feed the society around them, but the masses are far too stupid to understand it, and they are willing to get rid of them. This is indicative of the cultural distance that Romata believes to have from these people around him. But he also comes from a world that is far more advanced, so shouldn't he help them, educate them? This is one of the themes of the book. Should the progressor help and educate these people or let them figure it out on their own? That notion holds a lot of colonialism flavor in it that is actually indicative of the sentiments that were present in the 1960s Russia. The intelligentsia of the time believed themselves to be far more educated than the masses around them and thus more capable and smarter than everybody else. But they also started to believe the attempts at educating the masses were futile, as the masses were simply incapable of change. I don't want to step on the sticky ground that is internal colonization in this video, but let's just say that it's out there. But there is also the internal conflict within Romata, his duty as the progressor and his obligation to his societal group, the intellectuals. He has the colonization complex, but he's also powerless. The novel ends with an action by Romata that actually highlights the dead end that he found himself in. The next novel is Prisoners of Power, or more accurately translated as The Inhabited Island. It operates in generally the same space, but here the protagonist, he's a revolutionary. On planet Saraksh, the intellectuals are also persecuted. They are also caused physical harm and pain with daily transmissions that cause only harm to that strata of intellectuals, and everybody else actually gets them excited and riled up and kind of creates this sense of patriotism in them. A dig at TV propaganda, if I ever saw one. The protagonist, Maxim Kramer, he tries different roles during the course of the story, but in the end he manages to destroy the towers that were emitting the transmissions, but it looks like he only made things worse. The novels of this period, they highlight the crisis of enlightenment, the crisis of cultural distance, of colonialism, and in no small part because they saw the protagonist, the progressor, as being powerless. The second novel, set in the same universe as The Inhabited Island, Beetle in the Anthill, shows what happens if the progressor gets that power and how dangerous it actually can be. It shows the danger as viewing people as us versus them and how such power can have drastic consequences. That conflict and the evolution of the progressor comes to its culmination in the third novel set in the same universe, The Waves Extinguish the Wind, where the progressor gets to take that extra final step towards his own evolution, and he leaves the society behind. That same motif can be seen in other novel Ugly Swans, where the person who believed himself to be the progressor also gets left behind when others go further. And then the question is, was he really the progressor, and how does one deal with being left behind? Some describe this era as Strugatsky's disappointment with the whole idea of progress, of people who bring that progress on, and how the society might never be ready for it, how it will always be a few steps behind. In a sense, it's them going from rather exuberant optimism to rather sour pessimism. But there is also another stage in their literary journey. It is often characterized as psychological science fiction. Snail on the Slope, Roadside Picnic, and The Doomed City are the most notable examples of that stage. All three novels were not published until very much later, as the social satire became much more biting. Snail on the Slope carries a lot of surrealism in it. It is often compared to Kafka. The parallels to the Schloss jump at you pretty early on. The Roadside Picnic, it grapples with the ideas of knowledge, and The Doomed City explores the role of a person in the society while parodying the Soviet experiment. All three novels play with the idea of heterotopia, that meaning worlds within worlds, like they are mirror reflections of one another. Like in The Snail on a Slope, it's the mirror composition of the directorate and forest. In Roadside Picnic, it's the zone within Harmond, and in Doomed City, it's the entire city. It can be viewed as Strugatsky exposing the humanity's flaws. The characters and the societies in these novels seem to be lost cause. The hope is very hard to come by in these novels. But these books are probably the most powerful out of all of Strugatsky's fiction. They're deep, they ask a lot of questions, they provide you with thought, but they never truly give you answers. Now, let's talk Roadside Picnic. I'm going to recap the plot for you now. Normally, I don't care about spoilers when it comes to classical literature because the sum of plot points does not make a book great. But here, I read the book when I already knew everything important about the book. And I think specifically here, had I not known everything about it, it would have hit me harder. It still works, it's still meaningful, it's still impactful, but I think if you have a chance or inkling to read the book before I spoil it all for you, you probably should do that here. In the world of the novel, 13 years ago, 6 places on Earth became so-called visitation zones. Everyone thinks that the aliens have visited there and left. Since then, the zones are simply weird. The laws of physics don't apply there. The most mundane objects become kind of dangerous. But there are also other things, the artifacts that were left there behind by aliens and are way beyond anything that mankind has ever known. The events of the novel are set in the fictional town called Harmond, where one of the zones is located. There is a research institute that studies the zone and occurrences within it, but there are also people called stalkers who sneak into the zone illegally and bring stuff out of it to sell on the black market. Our protagonist, Frederick Schuchert, 23 years old, he's a former stalker. He's already spent some time in jail for it, but now he's working at the institute as an assistant to Dr. Kirill Platonov. Kirill studies the so-called empties. They emit an electromagnetic signal without any explanation that human sciences know. Red, quite taken by Kirill's enthusiasm about this whole situation, offers to show him a full empty that he's seen in the zone during his stalking days. Even with all the precautions taken when they go into the zone, as they retrieve the empty, Kirill steps into something that looks like a silvery web, and when they return from the zone, Kirill dies from a cardiac arrest later that day. We jump forward 8 years. Red has quit the institute and has gone back to being a stalker. He, along with another stalker called the Vulture, are trying to bring another artifact out of the zone, but the Vulture steps into something called the Witch's Jelly, and his legs stop working from knees down. He's scared that Red is going to leave him behind to die, just like the Vulture has done to many stalkers before, and so he offers to show Red the route to a golden ball that he claims can grant a person his deepest desire or wish. Red brings the Vulture out of the zone because it's the right thing to do. They share the bounty, but as Red goes to the bar to celebrate, he gets arrested by the police. He only gets a chance to make a deal with the people that he sells his stuff to, that his wife and daughter get taken care of. In the third installment, we follow a man called Noonan, who poses as a dealer for the Institute, but really he's working for secret services, trying to stop the stalkers from entering the zone. He gets a talking to from his boss for missing an operation that the Vulture is running. He is organizing picnics near the zone, and in the night the youngsters sneak into the zone. Noonan decides to go see Red, who's just gotten out of prison, to see what he knows about all of this. But on the way there, he stops to have a drink with Dr. Pillman, who's studying the zone. He asks him questions about the nature of the visitation zones and why and what that all means, but Professor can only offer him theories. The one that he favors is that aliens came, left some stuff behind and left, just like people do when they have a picnic on the side of the road and leave some garbage behind without worrying about what the ants are going to do about it. Nuna leaves the conversation without getting any answers, really, and goes to see Red. Redrick's family life is rather tragic now. The children of people who go into the zone, they are never really normal. His daughter, who was born with light fur all over her body, whom they affectionately called Monkey, she starts losing her mind and she's behaving more and more like an animal. Besides that, the cemetery in the zone became active, and the people who were buried there, they come out and come back into the city, basically walking dead or walking meat, because they have no consciousness or memories of who they were before. And one of those people was Redrick's father, who came back and is now living with them. In the night, both Monkey and the father, they don't really sleep, and the sound is coming from them, this screeching sound that can be heard all over the zone. Noonan leaves them in horror. In the fourth part, Redrick is walking through the zone, going to that golden ball that the vulture told him about. The road to it is dangerous as it is, but there is also a catch. In the end, right before the ball, there is the so-called meat grinder, so in order to get to the ball, somebody needs to walk through it and die first. In an act of revenge, Redrick takes the vulture's son Arthur with him, a young man who was one of the wishes that the ball granted to the vulture, a healthy child. As they travel to the ball, Red saves Arthur from one of the traps along the way on instinct, out of the goodness of his heart, but then he starts distancing himself from Arthur, justifies it in his head. Arthur's life for monkeys, he dehumanizes him by calling him a skeleton key. When they get to the ball, Arthur runs to the ball in excitement, crying out his wish, but he is instantly killed by the meat grinder. Red then tries to think of a wish to ask from the ball, but nothing comes to him besides Arthur's last words. Happiness to everybody, free, and nobody will go away unsatisfied. It's rather difficult to talk about philosophical fiction, isn't it? I've watched multiple lectures on the subject, and I'm no way closer to telling you what the theme is than I was when I first finished the book. This type of fiction, it leaves you with questions that you are supposed to answer yourself. On the surface, it is a story of a person's journey. All these supernatural elements are simply a backdrop to the transformation that Redrick goes through. We meet him at a point in life where he could turn his life around, but Kirill's death completely annihilates his faith in humanity, and so he falls down the rabbit hole that is the life of a stalker, a selfish, utilitarian existence, until he loses all hope, all sense of self, makes the ultimate sacrifice, and is forced to face his own failings and his own lack of words. Red as a protagonist is one that you would encounter in the fiction of this type. He is a person who's not willing to conform, he does not want to live by society's rules, he does not want to be part of the system, he confronts the society around him, he rejects it. He wants to be exceptional, he does not want to end up like his father, who was a simple cog in a factory machine. A tale as old as time. But because of his background and where he comes from, he does not see all of the choices available to him. So he thinks that money is the thing that is going to solve all of his problems, that it's going to give him freedom. He is a stalker because he is good at it, but it is also because it pays much better than an honest job could ever bring him. The flickers of moral that break through, like with Kirill, or when he saves the vulture's life, or with the witch's jelly, they get squashed one day or the other, and in no less by the need for money. Like with the witch's jelly, for example, he only hands it over to really sketchy characters when he thinks that it's the only way to provide for his wife and daughter, because that's the only other value that he has in life, his family. But in the end, his real problem is the one that he cannot solve with money. He cannot help his father or daughter with money. When he walks through the zone in the end to the golden ball, it is questionable if he truly believes that it's going to grant him his wish. He thinks that he wants to help his daughter and father, but the true reason for the mission is to get the ball out of the zone and sell it to the highest bidder. He might hope that the ball will grant him his wish, but he does not truly believe it. And here, Redrick is a man who's lost everything. He does not have anything else to lose. That's why the fourth part is labeled Redrick Schuchert and his age and nothing else. He does not have anything else. And I've heard the argument that only a man like that could get to the ball and ask for what he ended up asking for, happiness for all three, and no one will go away unsatisfied. These last few paragraphs of Red's internal monologue are so important. When faced with this artifact, Red does not know what to ask for or how to ask for it. In that moment, he's facing himself, his innermost thoughts and wishes, and he does not find anything better than the words of a boy he'd just killed. He does not have any words or thoughts of his own. An unaccustomed exercise thinking, that was the trouble. What was thinking anyways? I don't have the words. They didn't teach me the words. I don't know how to think. The bastards didn't let me learn how to think. He's not used to reflection. He was quite literally not taught it. It is also a callback to a conversation between Pillman and Noonan, because that's where Pillman gives this definition for reason. Usually a trivial definition is used. Reason is that part of a man's activity that distinguishes him from the animals. You know, an attempt to distinguish the owner from the dog who understands everything but just can't speak. And in that moment, Redrick, as the metaphorical ant, as a metaphorical dog, addresses the entity that he believes to be so much above him to find the answers in his soul, because he, Redrick, does not have the sense, does not have the thoughts, does not have the words to do it himself. And it is rather heartbreaking, isn't it? One of the lecturers suggested for all of us to try to do this thought experiment. If you found yourself in front of a golden ball that grants you your deepest wish, what would you wish for? Because that answer should reveal quite a bit about yourself to you. But at the same time, Redrick goes through a list of things that he could ask for, some of them rooted in hatred and vengeance, but in the end he turns out to be better than even he probably thought of himself, and he asks for happiness for all. This is a stark contrast to the only other person who's faced the ball, the vulture, and the vulture's wishes were all selfish, while Redrick's innermost wish is for the collective good. And who in this story was looking for the collective good other than him? Kirill, maybe? Arthur cried out for it out of naivety rather than the true deep desire to help everybody, I would imagine. Even Professor Pillman, he does not care for the humanity, he's much more interested in the deeper questions of why. This is also an indicator of theme. Look at the epigraph to the novel, a quote from Robert Warren. You have to make good out of the bad because that's all you've got to make it out of. Redrick, who's seen so little goodness in his life, has seen and done so much evil, in the end, when faced with himself, found the goodness in his heart after all. And while Red is our protagonist, he's not the only important character in the story. One of the parts is totally dedicated to man Noonan, and a focal scene in the story is his conversation with Professor Pillman. Pillman introduces various versions of what the visitation was and why it happened. He also describes various artifacts and occurrences that happen in the zone, but he's much more interested in the things that he cannot explain. He does not care about the things that break the laws of thermodynamics, he cares about why. Why the artifacts behave in the way that they behave, and more importantly, the consequences that they bring on. He has no explanation for what happens to children like Monkey, or more importantly even, for the accidents that happen around people who were in Harmon during the visitation. The violation of the law of causalities is what scares him, while Noonan is afraid of the walking dead. Because if Pillman cannot find the explanation for these events, then his entire worldview might be wrong and anything can happen. And this level of uncertainty is terrifying. There are three central characters that are faced with the same uncertainty, with an area or the event of the unknown that they have no chance of comprehending, and all three act differently. Pillman seeks to understand the zone, Noonan to control it, and Red to use it. And isn't it ironic that the only person to face the ultimate mystery of the zone, the golden ball, is Red? For me, this is the central theme: knowledge, sense, understanding, or lack thereof. I like the analogy that Strugatsky flipped the circle of knowledge. You would normally describe the things that you know within the circle and everything outside as the things that you don't. Here it's flipped. The things that we do not know and not understand is very much contained within the circle, and everything around it is things that we approximately know. We make attempts at understanding it. We send robots and even stalkers into this zone, but we're no closer to understanding it. There are also people like Gutalin who reject even the attempts at getting that knowledge. They buy the artifacts that were brought from the zone and bring them back into it. It also ties into the smaller theme of how we use that knowledge, for good or for evil. In the beginning, Red wants to bring the artifact for Kirill because he believes that Kirill is going to use it for the greater good, and in the end of the novel he does not care either way, even if in the end he still chooses the right path. Utilizing the visitation by aliens for this metaphor is quite apt. We think that we know everything about our world, but there is this whole universe out there, and who are we to say that there are not creatures out there who would treat us as ants and leave their garbage behind for us to figure out? It forces us to reassess our place in the world, the amount of things that we know, and more importantly, what we don't know. This is what I personally got from the novel. Others and you might probably get something else from it. There is an interpretation that makes the rounds now that the zone was a metaphor for the Soviet experiment and how the people that get out of it actually bring unforeseen consequences to the outside world, and how we now, after the fall of the Soviet Union, still try to go to that well to get artifacts and meaning from it even years later. I'm not a big fan of that reading. At the very least, I think it was done better in The Doomed City, but it is out there. I should also mention that Roadside Picnic had a pretty significant cultural impact. In a weird twist of fate, Chernobyl became the real-life zone with its own real-life stalkers who still sneak into the zone and bring stuff out of it, for better or for worse, really. In other media, there are two adaptations that are significant. One is the video game called Stalker. I have no comment on that. But two is a movie called Stalker by Tarkovsky. A few notes on the movie. It has very little to do with Roadside Picnic. The screenplay was written by the Strugatsky brothers, mostly Boris, but it was also rewritten 9 times because Tarkovsky was never happy with it until there was very much left of the original book in it. The movie is very much a Tarkovsky vision, so it cannot be a substitute for the book, if we assume any adaptation can truly be that. It is a completely new story with its own vision and its own message. So if you decide to watch it, I encourage you to view it as a standalone piece of media rather than an adaptation of this book. I haven't seen it, by the way. I don't think I would enjoy it. It's a Tarkovsky movie, after all. In conclusion, it is a book that I recommend for you to check out. Beyond the heavy themes, it's simply an interesting one to read, and it's executed well. Here, Strugatsky's style shines. We get glimpses into Redrick's life. The world building is done organically. We learn things about the zone and the characters as we go, and the philosophical themes are simply another layer to the book. My personal experience is that it's one of those books that requires a little bit of silence and a little bit of rest once you finish it. It provokes introspection because it leaves you with questions that you need to answer for yourself. But it is also sci-fi, so if you're a fan of the genre, go for it. And even if you aren't, it's a pretty good one for you to check out.